when we first met or connected, you were doing pieces that are similar to the higher Mo.
Yeah.
And since then, you've really transitioned to a whole different phase, and we've been talking about that. But before we get to like where you are now, can we go over that piece in particular and that series, and then talk about how like you've evolved to where you are now?
Yeah. Yeah. With that piece, I was really, that was like the first piece of some newer works that I was making, and I was really wanted to resource the barn. I grew up on a farm back in Michigan, and we had like a 200 plus year old barn that's in pretty good shape, and I spent almost every day in it. I had a huge skateboard ramp in it, which helped with that. But you know, it was always a point of inspiration. I always wanted to work with it. I never knew really how I could, but I always wanted to make barn paintings, and so like it was always in the back of my head as I was kind of going through grad school and learning some different stuff about, you know, just image building and working with the DA William and thinking through a bunch of different kind of methods and stuff. So then at the very end of it, it was kind of just like, man, like I didn't like what I was doing. I got kind of cornered, and I was like, I'm just going to start painting the barn. I had always had this idea to kind of do this rubbing of the beams, but I never really could figure out how to do it on canvas with paint. So, and I, like, as a painter, I've always kind of worked in like a printmaking type of way, like kind of gaining, like gathering textures from nature and stuff like that, and kind of applying those to canvas, thinking of different ways to paint. So, and I crawled up in the beams, I hung a canvas up there, I painted it white, I started sanding away the paint, and you know, just the hands-on attitude of it really like connected with me. And I started to kind of I had these beams, and then I brought that into my studio, and all of a sudden I like started kind of building the world around it based off my memory, which was awesome. Like it was, you know, I was working life size, so it was a little bit more like, oh yeah, there's a grain bin there. So I would like add the grain, and then I would say, oh yeah, there's that ladder. There was the light switch I used to grab to go up there, and kind of like try to relive it, which was pretty awesome. And was different than making like these pictures of the memory, but I was a lot more immersed in it. So the higher Mao is one of the hay mows that was in my barn. And like I said, I had the same structure as my friend's barn, so it was easy to translate. And basically I just went off memory and kind of like was going through and putting little elements from childhood. I remember my dad always had a bucket of rusty parts up there that I would grab and make little things out of. And, you know, there was always twine sitting there. There was always this grain bin down below. There was this insulation that used to pop out. So I was just kind of going through the construction and trying to like simplify it, make it a little bit more minimalist, and not have it be so like picture of something. You know, I wanted it to be a little bit more innovative in like how I was depicting that memory.
So, but going back to the beams,
Yeah.
you said that so you would take the canvas onto the beam, and then you like basically painted it, and then you started taking away the paint to get that pattern.
Yeah, and that's why that painting's made with a black canvas. I was just starting to figure out the process a bit. So
Okay.
what I was doing is trying, you know, so I crawl up in the beams, and I'm like, you know, 15 foot up in the barn, and then I stretch that canvas on those beams and sit up there and apply layers of paint and clear just so that it doesn't rip or anything like that. And then, um, you know, that was the first one I was doing, so it was like learning as I went. But yeah, I painted it white, and then started sanding into it to bring out the higher points of the beam, which kind of created like a negative, almost like a nocturne style of the beam. So it was kind of interesting to think about more of a night scene with that anyways. And the barn at night's always just kind of pretty ominous, like mysterious thing. Um, so yeah, so that was the process. I mean, like I said, it's almost, you know, similar to making a print for myself. And yeah, and then I added the big red barn door that would have been blocking that beam and stuff like that. And I just started, you know, kind of implementing these elements that reminded me of it.
So that, I mean, that adds a whole, because I never knew that. So this now that information just adds a whole new life to painting for me.
Yeah, yeah, it's
I
really
thought you
tactile.
were painting it, like
Right.
painting that, but no, I mean, Yeah, so that is almost like a documentation.
Yeah, exactly. And it was amazing too. I mean, I love that recording the history. These are like hand hewn beams, you
Mhm.
know, that somebody was sitting there and chopping down for a while. And all those marks show up, you know. So I love that I was using somebody's from, you know, 200 years ago, their marks in my painting now, contemporizing it. And the really amazing thing, though, too, was when I was rubbing on it, it picked up all the dust and dirt and stuff like that in the beams. So, like on the back side of the canvas is like a incredibly like a photographic version of it. It
Wow.
has color and everything from grains and stuff like that. It was amazing. I wish I could preserve that somehow. It was wild. Yeah.
Oh, that adds a whole other layer to it.
Yeah, so like in any of my barn paintings, what I was doing is after a while, I went back to Michigan with a huge roll of canvas, and I crawled up in my beams, which I have a much larger barn, so I was a little higher up,
Mhm.
and stretched like 20-foot lengths of beams, which kind of started to evolve into the making of separate canvases.
Mm.
So the reason I started making separate canvases because I had these pieces of canvas that had elements from where I was raised. So, I didn't want to sit there and plan the whole painting out first, but I did know I wanted to use barn beams or concrete chunks or, rubbing from the side of my well house back home. But I didn't want to like corner myself into like trying to think of the whole image before I even started it. I was trying not to draw or do any sketching before any of these paintings and still try to adhere to that pretty strongly. So that's where it became like, okay, I'm just going to get the material, come back to the studio, figure out where it goes to make this image. So that started, which we showed at for the summer school show,
Hmm.
works that were made multi canvases, 5 different canvases, 6 different canvases. That it was a way for me to piece all that stuff in. Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I went to grad school, one thing that Didier knew and that I knew is that I had to break the printmaking tendencies a bit. And I think that's where a lot of like the analog kind of printmaking came in, like this more tactile application of paint, because I was making Prince or Mickley and Thomas and stuff like that. So they were really graphic and, really embellished and stuff like that. But it wasn't like raw. Like I wanted this rawer side that was a little bit more just like born from the earth, so to say. So yeah, as a printmaker, I got into being very graphic and clean edges and stuff like that. And working with the barn and kind of getting a little bit more grittier was a way for me to break that. And it
Hmm.
became a little bit more, I think, apparent in those paintings as like this kind of dichotomy between those two, like the graphic style and then these like rough beams where there's paint, no clean edges and stuff like that. So but yeah, printmaking is, it's a huge part of I mean, ever since I was a kid, I was silkscreening back in high school. So,
Yeah.
so it's been a pretty serious part of I don't do any printing in my paintings.
Yeah.
I've always made paintings and I've printed for other artists, which I really like. It's kind of like my skilled trade that kept me in the fine arts and, introduced me to a lot of artists and a lot of different ideas, a lot of creativity, immersed me in it. But then I had kind of had enough and had to get out of there.
Yeah.
So,
But I
yeah.
think I mean, I think that part of your history is what makes your work also very unique and very much you. Because
Sure.
while you're trying to, take away that, what you were saying when you were working with your masters, you were trying to break away from it, but it's still very evident, but in your way.
Yeah, well,
It's your stamp, it's your fingerprint.
yeah, and you can only get so far away from yourself, anyways, right? So it's like I was always happy. I'm happy with the way that it's in the work now, and I was happy with the work that, like in the barn pieces, how it's in that work. Like I don't, yeah, that's great to me. Like you got to really try to stretch, and then it still comes back, but only maybe a little halfway,
Yep.
or there's other things that you found out while that stretch was happening. So I always thought that was, I mean, for me, grad school and working underneath Didier was huge for that reason because he knew exactly what I needed to do. He's an amazing educator. So it's like
Yeah.
he pushed me in the right way. And I didn't have to like I didn't totally forget where I came from either. So
It's
and
an evolution.
that's the thing about printmaking. I mean, I come from right around Flint, Michigan, and like all my mom's family worked in the auto industry, and then my dad's side of the family are farmers, and this mechanical type of thought and stuff like that. That's just ingrained like in my culture that I grew up in too. So, we all know how to MacGyver stuff pretty well. We know how to make stuff pretty well. So printmaking kind of, if you're in the arts, as I was one of few around there, printmaking really serves this kind of exactness and professional side of the arts that I might not have been able to like get where I am right now without having that experience as well. So like I'd say it's a Midwest type thing too.
But that's also another aspect of your art that I always talk to you about, that I've always liked about your work, is because the what you incorporate in your work is very much like your history, and it's an American history that I think a lot of times we forget. Like even that simple thing that you were just talking about, like the barn, the history of the barn and how barns were made. I just learned how barns were actually constructed.
Yeah.
And it was intense and insane how they had to be made. I mean, it was an entire community that had to be a part of that in order for it to be created.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's also part of our American history that, I don't know, that's one of the reasons why I've always gravitated to your work.
Sure.
I think also because it's very foreign to me, because I grew up in New York. We don't have barns. Well, where I grew up, we didn't have barns. Right. I grew up in a suburb or in the city. So that Americana for me is something that I kind of romanticize in a way, I guess. So.
In undergrad, I went to SUNY Purchase, and I've been out here almost longer than I've been at home at this point. But one of the things that during my thesis in grad school that I really started to observe is that like a lot of the skills or knowledge from that area might not be so useful out here. And that was some of the stuff that I tried to express in my paintings and through some of the writings I did in my thesis. Was kind of, and try to show that, not a lot of people understand or get to see that a lot. And I think it's can be really beautiful and really pretty awesome too, without being like the normal idea of rural America. My family, my parents are a couple old hippies, that they were out there. And there's just things that, my dad grew up on a farm, a huge dairy farm, a couple miles up the road. And, it's not your typical, like what people might think about in rural America. And I always wanted to kind of try to not exploit it, but show people that like, hey, there's a really cool side to this too, or whatnot. Or we were only an hour from Detroit. We were only 20 minutes from Flint, so it's, I don't know. There's a different kind of language that happens out there.
Yeah. But I think that's translated in your work as well, because it's not like you are not creating work that over romanticizes this experience. Like it's very, I look at it romantically because I've, but when I look at your work, I know that your perspective isn't like this romanticism of this world. It's
no, and I don't,
yeah, it's
just the tools and the it's like the attitude a little bit. It's the tools. It's like the way to approach it, the imagery and strokes. I mean, like I said, I rarely use a brush to paint. It's usually some type of tool that I fasten together to make it like the process is definitely a big part of the paintings. And I mean, it's just like the aesthetic really is that it's always something I wanted to take from home. I always called it like this farmer's aesthetic. Like a lot of times I'll test my paint right out on the canvas because I'm like, like if you were like, I don't know, trying to make something real nice and paint it real nice, like a farmer might mix the paint like on something else that's nice and then paint the thing that's nice. It's kind of like this impractical type of way, but I always like love that kind of attitude about just like getting done what you want to get done and like, using what you have around you. So, I often will mix a color and I'll test it somewhere on my canvas, and I'll just leave all that, I feel like it's a lot more of a handmade type thing.